Welcome to the Anode Systems webinar on cathodic protection of underground propane tanks and pipes. I'm Hans Schmolt. I'm a corrosion engineer here at Anode Systems in Grand Junction, Colorado. I'm the guy that wrote the manual, the PERT manual, that was eventually modified to suit the industry. I'm going to speak today with you about anodes, cathodic protection, troubleshooting tips, how anodes work, why they work, where they should be installed, various aspects of the whole idea of protecting these underground tanks. I'll give you a little slideshow on the that I used to give to meeting seminars, the actual seminars, and then we'll summarize the high points of this presentation, and then take any questions if there are any questions. I may have answered everybody's questions I didn't even know they had. So let's get started. Thank you for signing up. I hope it's worth your while. Your time is valuable to you and your employer. I appreciate your employer's decision to invite me to give a talk to you all. I like talking. In fact, I talk too much. I'm looking for my advance clicker, and so far it hasn't advanced. I don't know what the problem is. Okay, let's try this. Well, now it's working. Okay, this is a typical installation at a house, right? Piping in and out of the service piping on an old tank is often metal, could be steel, often copper. Nowadays they're plastic. The anodes are capable of protecting piping if it's coated. But you have to isolate it. You have to isolate the piping from the house at the meter with a dielectric union. This is an example of a catalog where products are illustrated. Copper sulfate half cell, the little yellow half cell. You got your bagged anode, your voltmeter, your tester. An illustration of a couple of anodes on a tank. Price list for replacement parts. Little hose clamps that you can get to connect an anode wire to the piping or to the riser of the underground tank. Some basic facts. The 17-pound anode doesn't weigh just 17 pounds. It weighs 40 pounds, maybe 45. If you soak that in water, that anode weighs probably 50 pounds. Copper sulfate electrodes, there's a lot of questions about those guys. How do they work? Well, as I tell others, if you can tell me how a thermometer works to measure temperature, I'll tell you how a copper sulfate electrode works to measure voltage. But basically, it's a copper rod with some copper sulfate crystals and distilled water. That's all it is. And how it works is beyond the scope of this presentation. There are questions that a lot of people have. One of them is the ground corrosive? Well, I can walk out of my office here and walk around the office on the dry ground, and it's not corrosive because it's dry. If I were to walk out after it rained, I'd be tracking mud back into my office. Well, that means that it's corrosive. Well, how does that mean it's corrosive? Well, the ground is sticking here because it's clay, and what makes clay stick is little electron charges in the clay that makes it conductive. So clay is not sand. Sand isn't pea gravel. Sandstone is different from shale. All these sedimentary soil types have a different characteristic, but if it's clay, it's going to stick to your feet if it's wet. So if it sticks, it's corrosive. If it doesn't stick, like wet sand does not stick, then it's typically not corrosive. Now there's always a qualifier, there's always exceptions. If you have a sandy soil and it rains a lot, like in the Gulf Coast, the ground is going to be relatively clean of salts. Salts being fertilizer or sidewalk salt or my dog's pee. you have chemicals in sand that can make it conductive, make it corrosive. But as a rule, sand, being quartz, is not a conductive earth. It's not a corrosive earth. It's the chemicals that you add to it, like fertilizer. And we'll show you that as an example here in a minute. Do you need to change the crystals in an electrode? If you can hear crystals rattle in your electrode when you shake it, no. Now, the liquid in it, you can't see it if it's a new electrode, but if it's an older electrode that has a window, you can see the liquid. And if the liquid's kind of whitish, it's probably needs to be changed because it's got an impurity in it. When it's a new solution, it's a clear blue solution. Over time, when you set it on the ground, the chemicals in the earth might weep into the porous ceramic plug, might through osmosis soak up into the plug and turn that liquid more of a milky color. So you can change the crystals by just taking the tip, the pointed tip, if it's pointed, unscrew that, take a coffee filter, pour everything into a coffee filter, drain the liquid out, flush the electrode with tap water, and then rinse it with distilled water, and then put those crystals back into your electrode, add distilled water, and then let it soak for a couple hours. Let those crystals dissolve to where they are a saturated solution. Okay. If you run out of crystals over time, we sell crystals. You can buy crystals, not a big deal. Do you need to test a customer-owned tank? Well, technically you should. The code in some states, like in Colorado, is states that every existing tank needs to be protected against corrosion. Well, if it's not your tank, well, then they need to do it. Well, how do you bridge that gap? Well, you should tell your customer that buys your propane that it's your propane, but their tank, and if they had a leak, you both would be in the same boat. The issue is more about the propane than the condition of the tank. So you're assuming a liability if you fill up a customer's tank that's not protected. So how do you convince the customer that he needs to protect his tank? Well, you've got resale value associated with a tank. You've got safety. Safety is probably number one. Loss of product is also an issue. There are ways that you might explain to the customer that it's in his interest to protect that tank, and then you can do it for him. I often say that a technician, service technician, is like an EMT. You're the first responder. Those folks trust you. They know you because you work for the propane distributor, you marketer. Excuse me. You're there. You're identified by either your uniform or your shirt or the company truck. They don't trust me up in Grand Junction, Colorado. You're the guy that they would listen to. I've been down this road. They don't know me. Why would they trust me? So tell your customer that if they're not convinced they need to upgrade their tank with an anode, let you know so that you can document that they refused to upgrade or weren't interested. Let's say it's not as strong a word. Maybe your district manager can explain to them why they should protect their propane tank. Sometimes you have a choice. Do I want zinc or magnesium anodes? Well, zinc is a better anode where the ground is saline, like along the ocean. I don't know how many miles of shoreline the United States has, but if you had a tank near the shore, near like not a beach house, for example, you might could justify using zinc anodes. We've got the Great Salt Lakes out in Utah. You have salt flats out in Idaho. There are places where there is salt, and so zinc works well in salty environments, but mostly magnesium is the way to go. Now, the anodes that you buy have zinc in them. The zinc is an alloy. When you hear the word AZ63, AZ stands for aluminum and zinc, 6 stands for 6% aluminum, and 3 stands for 3% zinc. Those are alloys that are purposely added to magnesium. Now, all magnesium anodes come from China. Don't let anybody kid you. If they come from Singapore or Hong Kong or Mexico or Puerto Rico, they're made in China. They used to be made here in the United States. They used to be made in Oklahoma, Texas, Ohio. But environmental rules and EPA rules, workman's comp rules made it impractical for U.S. manufacturers to make anodes in the United States. So China is willing to sacrifice their workers' health, their air quality, and their water quality to make us magnesium anodes. The magnesium anodes that we buy now cost about the same as they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I know it's kind of hard to believe, but that's the fact. We used to buy them back in 1984. And it's amazing that the price of magnesium metal has not really changed. It's because of the cheaper labor in China, less government regulation. Now, other things go up: bags, gypsum, backfill, copper wire, labor, liability insurance, product liability insurance, workman's comp insurance. All that stuff goes up. Freight goes up. Okay. All right. Now, I put this on because there's gonna be a time when you read a voltage reading that's not 8.5. The magic number is 0.85. That's like your body temperature, 98.6. Well, if you're not at 8.5, technically that tank is not completely protected. The state rules, the national code is going to call you out on it and say this isn't good enough. You got to draw the line somewhere, and 8.5 is the line. So how can you make it better? You can take a different reading a foot in all directions. If you get a good reading of 8.5 a foot away, write that one down and not worry about the 8.4. If it doesn't change, if it's 8.4 on all locations, you can add a little bit of water. If you knew where the anode was, you could add water to the anode. There are ways to get that voltage to bump up just a little bit, and all it takes is a little bit more current from the anode. And the way you get more current is to add some water. If you knew where the anode was, surefire way to get more current is to add a little bit of salt. Believe it or not, rock salt, table salt will add enough electrolyte to the ground over the anode if you know where the anode is. Now, you don't want to put it over the tank, obviously. Salt is corrosive to tanks. But that's what anodes like. Anodes like salt. And that's, you don't want to put it on the grass if there's grass involved. You'd have to bury that salt a foot below grade to leach down to where your anode is, okay? Now, if you had a reading of 0, 0, 0, there's lots of reasons why you might see that. You might have the boot on your electrode. Your voltmeter might be off. You might be on the wrong scale. You might have a dead battery. You might not have good contact with the earth. You always take some water with you so you can put a couple of ounces on the ground. I've seen this reading 0.00, and I can guarantee you that the anode was still in the plastic bag underground. So it can happen. It's just unusual, but that's why, the anode being still in the plastic bag. All right, troubleshooting tips, Q&A. If you get a good reading on one side of the tank but not the other, picture the current from the anode as light. If you could see, if you had superpowers, right? If you could see the current as light from a light bulb, on a dry day, that anode might be like a nightlight, putting out a little bit of current. On a wet day, after it rains or in the spring when everything's thawing or melting, you're going to have a lot more moisture in the ground, and it's going to be generating more electricity because of the moisture. Well, that might look like a 40-watt light bulb instead of a nightlight. Now, if you had the ability to add a little fertilizer or salt, there's different types of salts that increase the conductivity of the earth. You can change that output from 40 watts to 60 watts because you've changed the electrolyte. That's the earth that the anode's in. If that doesn't do the job, you may have to add a new anode. How old is the anode? Well, you don't know. If you look at the data plate on the tank and the tank says 1999, and here we are 20 years, 21 years later, that anode's gone. It's been consumed. You're going to need a new anode, a new light bulb. You're going to need a new battery. Okay? If you look inside the dome and you see white paint, well, odds are that tank was painted when it was installed, and if it was painted, it probably was painted with a petroleum-based black coating, which isn't really made for underground. It's a petroleum-based, which is food for bacteria. Bacteria can feed on petroleum products. So you're going to need more light bulbs. And if your anode doesn't protect the other side of your tank, you may look to see if you have a copper service line. If you have a copper service line, that copper is like a black hole for this light that the anode is generating. The copper is a much better conductor than steel, and the current will be attracted to that copper if it's not isolated from the tank at the dome with a union, dielectric union. Here's some interesting pictures. This is Pensacola Beach. That's the Holiday Inn behind that propane tank. And that propane tank was used to cook food in the kitchen. I don't know if it was used to heat the building, but we got out of the car to go check out the beach. And lo and behold, we about stumbled over this tank. And you've got the AGUG tank, and you can barely see the lid off to the right of the tank. Cigarette butts everywhere in that sand. Thank goodness there wasn't a leak, but that was an active tank there on Pensacola Beach. That was back in 1988. There are 3 tanks in this picture. They're along along that fence where the trees are planted. The tanks are right at the base of those trees. There's your dome. You got a water sprinkler head. You got these beautiful flowers. You know, they fertilize those flowers. They water them. Boy, they changed that non-corrosive dry dirt that the tank was set into a very corrosive environment. And then you're going to have the tree roots eventually enveloping that tank, which they have done. That was taken back when the tanks were new. And those trees are probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter now. So there's no way to get those tanks out without taking the trees out as well. It was on the downslope of the pool. Pools have chlorinated water. Chlorine is corrosive to steel. It's corrosive to copper and brass. So you add that on top of the fertilizer, and you got a very corrosive location. Here in Stowe, Vermont, you've got a couple of propane tanks set way out from the Midway Lodge, where they cook food, where they heat the lodge. The tanks were protected on the outsides, but not on the inside. And the reason being is you had bare copper service lines going up to this regulator, and the copper intercepts the current meant for the tanks. And I'll bet those tanks are bare. So you can protect parts of the tank, but not all of it, which means that you still have corrosion going on in other parts of that tank, even though you're protected where the anode's installed. Lots of reasons tanks corrode. As I've talked about, water. Out here in Colorado, we have snow, we have rain, we have irrigation, and there's groundwater. I was talking to somebody the other day. They dug down, well, my former employee, digging down to test where his house is going to be built. He had groundwater 4 feet deep, and he's out in the desert. It flows underground in the gravels. You got fertilizers, salts, ammonia, sulfur, nitrates, chemicals that make plants grow. Road salt, sidewalk salt, water softener salt. If you're on if you have a system that adds water, you've got drain field salt. Mag chloride is used to control dust out here. It's used to control ice. It's got a film to it. It's hard to get off your vehicle when you go to the car wash. Oxygen oxidizes iron. That's why red beds are red out in Texas. That's why red beds are red out in Colorado. Iron is one of the most common, probably the most common metallic ion in the earth, unless you consider silicon. Silicon is part of the sand grain. Sand is made of silica and oxygen, but it's stable as sand. It doesn't oxidize. Iron does, and iron is always looking for electrons. Copper is a common metal in our industry. It's used for gas service lines. In the old days, when copper wasn't as expensive, you could afford to run copper service lines to your homes or businesses. Now it's more practical to use plastic. Sidewalk salt at the ski areas. A gross example of somebody not caring about their job. They just went out and threw a whole bucket or can of salt in one spot. They should have sprinkled it over the entire sidewalk. Soil is probably the most common cause of corrosion. We have clay out where we are in Colorado. Georgia would have clay. If it sticks to your feet, it's clay. If it's unweathered clay, it's shale. Shale is unweathered clay. Mud comes down on as rain, deposited water deposited sediment. Even large rocks can be a source of corrosion. If you have a large rock up against the tank, it's the lowest resistance path from the tank to earth, where that rock touches the steel. Even there, you have a corrosion cell. The backfill that you put around your tank might be pea gravel, it might be sand, but there's a lot of pyrite in earth. Lots sand, we have that in Colorado. It's associated with shale. I've seen it associated with limestone in Missouri. Pyrite is a normal form of iron sulfide. When it decomposes, it ends up as sulfuric acid and iron oxide, which stains brown. It's common in sand and gravel. Mine tailings out west You find those in aspen, telluride, all your gold and silver mining districts. We have uranium out here. We have molybdenum back where you are. Um, I don't know what kind of mines might have existed. There was gold back east. There's gold up north. There's copper. There's a lot of history in the United States mining, but they used metals, chemicals to get the leach the minerals, the metal out of the ore. Those acids may have collected in the earth. The chemicals may have uh, not migrated too far away, depending on the location. If it's still present, you won't see much growing on mine tailing piles. It'd be kind of barren. Coal mines, they had mine tailings. That's where they washed the coal and didn't keep the shale. Well, you can't get much to grow on these mine tailings. In Oklahoma, they strip mined coal. They strip mined in the Appalachian Mountains. Well, you don't see trees and grass growing on surface mined land like you do where it wasn't mined. Drain fields I mentioned earlier, whatever goes into your laundry or your toilets end up in your leach field downstream from your septic tank. Who knows what's in that? Electric currents are an issue. AC and DC from poorly grounded homes. Our most recent example out here was in Aspen. AC and DC currents are corrosive. Our books used to say AC doesn't cause it, but they've changed their opinion. Direct current from poorly grounded homes or from, let's say, your rapid transit lines, they can be a source of currents that will collect on other structures and possibly a propane tank. If your home isn't grounded well, it's your meter, your electric meter. It might take a path on your copper service line from your house if there's no dielectric union, which you should have by now. And it may go out to where your tank is and corrode the pipe. Things like that can happen. That's just what we've been talking about. We're back to this tank. It's so pretty, but it's so destructive. Having trees right next to the tank is not going to help that tank. Bacteria eat iron. The oil and gas industry has that problem with their downhole pipes, their casings. If they pipeline wet gas to a gas plant, they have internal corrosion that's caused by bacteria that live in the earth. And I believe I saw on 60 Minutes, they find bacteria, I think it's 2 miles deep in the gold mines of South Africa. Now, how bacteria was able to live 10,000 feet below the surface, and it may be deeper than that. I mean, bacteria metabolize iron, sulfides. They live in the bottom of the ocean where they have these subterranean volcanoes. They're pretty hardy critters. We talked about electric currents from poorly grounded houses. We've talked about stray currents. The lightning is a stray current. It may go to a tank. It's hard to say. Lightning takes all paths to ground. We've talked about pyrite. In Stowe, Vermont, they have graphite beds. That's used to be coal that turned to graphite when the mountains were formed from coal. Urine, you might think that's a stretch, but I've seen a buried propane tank on the other side of a petting zoo. And the goats and the sheep are little critters. They like to pee along the fence. Well, that's where the tank was, underground. I've seen salt crystals underneath hitching posts where horses are tied up at ski resorts. Um, I've seen road salt crystals along access roads to ski areas. So if you have a propane tank anywhere close to a feedlot, you very well might have urine, which is salt and ammonia, uh, other waste minerals corroding your tank. You're lucky that this isn't a propane tank. This is a gasoline tank, but that shows you a little pinhole. That hole's big enough to leak thousands of gallons of gasoline into the groundwater. In your case, it's vapor. You don't have liquid leaking out of tanks, but that vapor, if it doesn't freeze the outside of the ground around your tank, eventually makes its way into possibly the trench line into your to a home or a business if the service line goes underground into a basement or a heater or a water heater or a home heater is. If you see scaling, that's salt, that's sodium chloride. That's common wherever roads are salted. That's sodium chloride caused. Metals are not a naturally forming mineral unless it's gold or copper. They form as elements of compounds. Magnesium is formed in magnesite, for example, but you got to separate the magnesium from the carbonate ions. But it has a voltage. Your bagged anode typically is a 1.5, 1.6 value, not a 1.75. Again, you have some zinc and aluminum in your alloy. Zinc has a typical voltage of 1 volt. If you find anything, if you doubt your voltage reading that you're getting, find a galvanized nut, bolt, washer, screw, anything that's galvanized. You can pour a couple ounces of water on the ground, or you can put it on a paper towel on your desk. Put your electrode on your desk on the wet towel or on the ground, and get something that's galvanized, and use your other wire to touch the other item that's galvanized, and you should read about a volt. If you're not reading a volt, something's not right with your voltmeter or your testing equipment or your procedure. You should always see something close to a volt for zinc. Aluminum happens to have a voltage similar to zinc. It's used as an anode for saltwater applications, offshore, in saltwater storage tanks, in heater treaters. Aluminum, pure aluminum, obviously, is a little bit different than something alloyed with aluminum. Mild steel is different from clean and shiny mild steel is different from rusty steel. If you get a 0.2 of a volt, either you have some old steel, but you may have copper. Typically, I would assume that you have a copper service line. You wouldn't see lead. I've seen lead pipes. Lead pipes are long gone unless you live in Flint, Michigan, and then you got lead pipes. If you're vice president of the United States, you had lead pipes going into the Blair House when you were vice president. George Bush had what do you call it? Thyroid. I'm going to say cancer. And then Barbara Bush had thyroid cancer. And then their dog Millie had the canine version of thyroid cancer. Well, they deduced that the old house there, and I guess it's Georgetown, had lead pipes, and they replaced their lead pipes with I don't know, plastic or copper, and and um, and that's what was the cause of their cancer, thyroid cancer, and that's the problem they've got in Flint, Michigan, and a lot of old uh, developments, turn of the century, 1800s, vintage, maybe even earlier, um, homes that were built uh, years and years ago, or they built them with lead pipes. High silicon cast iron is in there because we have that as an anode for rectifiers that we'll talk about some other time. Mill scale on steel, who cares about that, right? But it has its own particular noble, stable voltage. Carbon, graphite, coke breeze, that's carbon. They used to smelt coal to make coke so they could turn iron ore into iron, cast iron. Magnesium anodes, as I said earlier, uh, don't weigh 17 pounds. They weigh 40 to 45 pounds packaged, depending on the size of the bag and the grain size of the backfill. Ours is very ground up, powdery. So ours typically weigh 40 pounds. You can get an anode in all sizes and shapes, depending on what you're going to protect. Your typical anode size is 17 pounds. You may have installed a 9-pounder years ago, and that just lasts half as long as a 17-pounder. You may get an opportunity to install an anode on a government job. They may want a bigger anode. If 17 pounds works great, well, gosh, 32 ought to be even better. Well, it's just longer living, that's all. Which, if it were a hard place to get to, 32-pounder might make sense. The package weight of these anodes range from 40 to 45 pounds. If you soak it in water and then put it in the ground, it probably weighs 65 pounds. The powder that's around an anode isn't magnesium, it's gypsum. Same mineral as sheetrock, wallboard. All right, bentonite is mixed in on purpose. It's volcanic clay. It's like a sponge. Bentonite is found in the Clearasil to soak up oils from teenagers' faces. It's used around gasoline pumps. If you overspill your gas tank, they may have to come out and throw some bentonite pellets on the ground. Well, that's the same stuff as kitty litter. Soaks up cat urine. Bentonite, and then you have a little dash of sodium sulfate, which is a salt. It's not sodium chloride, it's sodium sulfate. You can taste the sodium. Sodium is what makes salt taste salty. Anode wires or standard wires are 10 feet long. There are times when you want a longer wire. We make them here 20 feet long for some applications. You can order them with 20 feet of wire if you like. A typical insulation is TW. It's more of a rubbery insulation as opposed to THHN, which is more of a plastic coating. Both work fine. Your ring terminals, we can put a ring terminal on an anode if you need it. We're a factory here. We make anodes. We've been making anodes since 1984. That's a reason I wrote the manual. We used to get a lot of calls. Why do I need an anode? Where do I put it? How long does it live? How long does it last? Ground's not corrosive. Why do I need anodes? And on and on. Where do you place them? How the best place to put an anode is under the tank. If you have a backhoe sitting there digging a hole, dig an extra foot or two, drop the anode in under the tank, run your wire up to the side of the hole, anchor it with a dirt clod, set your tank in. After you set your sand and your gravel and your cinder blocks or whatever base that you might have to put in, and then any water that makes its way down to where the tank was installed through the pea gravel or the sand soaks in around that anode. And the light source is typically equidistant from the ends and the sides. You get a better distribution of that current. you get a good reading, typically all around the tank. How to install an anode? Like I said, underneath the tank is the best. You can put them like cars on a like wheels on a car. You can caddy corner these anodes, upper left, lower right. On a 500 gallon tank, one anode should be enough. On a new 1,000 gallon tank, even one anode could be enough under the center of the tank. We typically say two because we don't know how good a quality of the coating you have. We don't know if you've isolated the piping from the tank. We don't know if you backfill with granite fines back in New England. There's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know if it's dry. Out west, it's dry. You might need that extra battery, that extra voltage, that extra light to protect a 1,000 gallon tank. It's not a lot of cost for the insurance. And how long do they live? If it's dry, they're going to last 50 years, an anode. If it's wet, they might last 10 or less. Depends on what's in the ground that makes the ground conductive. Wet sand is going to last, your anode's going to last longer than if it's wet clay. Okay. You ought to put some water on that anode before you walk away. I don't know if you have water available from a garden hose or from a bar ditch, or if you bring your own water in the form of gallon jugs. That's what we use. But water will make that anode put out current. If you put the anode in dry dirt, bury the tank, you might get lucky and you might get enough current out of that anode, but you might not. You might have to wait for 6 months for the rain to activate that anode. You ought to water it with at least a gallon of water. Okay. Your connection to the tank, nowadays they use ring terminals on those threaded bolts on your riser pipe. We make a hose clamp that fit around those riser pipes. You slip your wire into a little copper sleeve, mash it down with a hammer, and you can connect on to the riser pipe with a screwdriver. Okay, coatings. Paint is really not a coating. It's an aesthetic surface finish, but a coating is made of something else. If it's a chemically cured coating, it's a resin, fusion bond epoxy you see on your piping. That's a chemically cured synthetic resin that will chemically cure and provide a good coating, more so than tape, more so than some kind of a paint, unless you're using coal tar, which is different. Coal tar is immune to bacteria because it's tar from coal, not tar from oil. But your coatings need to be able to withstand attack from salt and chemicals and weathering and temperature and stresses and electrons and electrons from electricity. Okay. Here's a tank that was installed and dug up. Oh, it was installed before the turn of the century, I like to say. That's before 2000. Okay. It was painted probably at one. Yeah, it was painted with a coating, a black coating. But if you look at it closely, you can take your fingernails and scratch that coating off. So it didn't last, and therefore your tank became bare. And because of that, you needed more anodes to protect that tank. And that tank didn't have any anodes on it. There's no evidence of a wire on that tank. So it was corroding, and maybe that's why they dug it up. So your coatings, you want them to resist water. Plastic is a coating, but so are these chemically cured resins. You want it to last a long time. You want it to resist saltwater attack, sulfate attack, chemical attack, fertilizer, leach field, animal waste, alkali salts like we have out in Colorado, cracking and flaking and blistering and oxidation. I've seen new tanks with a whitish oxide on it. Well, that's the exterior coating oxidizing. Sunlight, UV light, oxygen. Oxygen is really bad stuff. It oxidizes water. Believe it or not, oxygen. I've set a glass of water out and it doesn't taste as good as it used to because it oxidized. Oxidation is what's bad on food. Oxygen is not good unless you want to breathe it, right? Bacteria and fungus is an issue. You go down south, and everything down in south where it rains a lot has a black, gray shade to it. Well, that's a fungus. It's living on the surface of your structure, and fungus is just a microscopic organisms that create residues. They're a living organism. Bacteria, same thing. Bacteria makes salts, acids when it metabolizes sulfur. Bacteria is also equally bad to oxygen. Coatings, we've talked about its ability to resist sand. My windshield's got pits on it. That's from sand blowing against my windshield. Imagine the truck driving down the interstate running at 70 miles an hour with a headwind, and wherever there's sand, it could be along the ocean, it could be out here in Colorado. We had a front came through last week. You couldn't even see the mountains of all the windblown sand. All right, that's being sandblasted. Then you've got, was it coated on a Friday or a Monday? It could have been a Monday when guys are kind of getting over their weekend, or on a Friday when they're excited to get away from the office or the warehouse, and where they do their sandblasting and preparation of tanks. People are looking forward to the weekend. They're not focused as much on their job as they might be on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I think somebody's told me years ago you'd want a car made on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday instead of Friday and Monday for that reason. Dielectric strength, that's an ability of a plastic or a rubber to insulate electrical current. Your extension cords, they have a good electrical dielectric strength. You don't feel the shock when you hold an extension cord. Same idea. Your skin has a resistance to electricity unless it's wet. I don't know what the electrical resistance is of skin, but certainly it's better when it's dry than when it's wet. Dielectric unions, that little red plastic insert on a union makes it a dielectric union. There's another component that's rubber that's inside. It looks like an O-ring. You can't see it there, but it's in there, two-part. This particular union was a one-piece, actually, it looks like. But that was made for copper to steel. That's the kind of union you'd find on top of your water heater at home in your house. These are gas unions, the first three. The last one is that copper union I was telling you about. We've talked about electric currents. If you can't see them electrically, this is a schematic of how electricity flows when there's no dielectric union involved anywhere. You got your tank is corroding because it's connected to other metals. And believe it or not, you got a copper ground rod over by your electric service. Well, that tank conceivably is corroding to protect that copper ground rod, because the copper ground rod is interconnected to your propane tank via your water heater and your gas line. Now, that should have been fixed with dielectric unions, okay, at your gas meter. That isolates the propane tank from the rest of the house. The dielectric unions are important items in your installations. They weren't used as a rule years ago, but now that we know the beneficial use of a union, they should be there. All right, how do you test for an anode? Well, you got to have a voltmeter, you got to have that electric or that half cell. This particular tank was not protected. That's the voltage of unprotected steel. The tank serves a historic hotel. People at the hotel didn't want to talk to me because I didn't live close to them. I was from out of town. I wasn't the service rep. I was an engineer. Might as well have been from Mars, I guess. But they would trust you. They would trust the service tech. They would, if you were to show them a picture of their tank, you could send them a picture from your cell phone. Say, this is what I took out there on your tank. It's not protected today. The picture documents the date and the place and the location. You have protected yourself as a marketer from some liability if you take that picture and put it in an email to your customer. Copy your company. That way you've documented the date, time, and place, right? And then from there, somebody else can go to bat for you on why they need to fix this. Your tank is sick, folks. Your tank is not healthy. You're proving it right then and there. Look at that. Look at that copper to steel or non-metallic service line. That's oxidizing. That's from rain. Well, your tank is wet all the time, not just when it rains, but all the time. So it's going to look the same way. There's your electrode. They're those pretty blue crystals. They dissolve and they rattle when there's crystals in your electrode. You take the tip of that electrode, turn it upside down, the electrode, add your distilled water. That's an old electrode. They had a window in them. You can buy little add-ons to an electrode so that you can see crystals and water if you like. That's something that we have if you need them. Chances are you won't need crystals there for 10 years. There's a reading that's not much different from the other one. Remember the 0.58? Well, that's 0.60. That's clear across the United States. That's 3,000 miles away in our backyard, not far from those tanks along the swimming pool. That tank's been unprotected ever since it was installed. And you wouldn't know it until you take a reading. It's like getting a physical. You're the doctor, you're the EMT, you're the one that takes the blood pressure, the heart rate. You're taking the vitals of that tank. And that tank was unprotected on that date. As is this one. Oh my gosh. I love this picture. We had fun posing with this. A Marlboro man, right? Getting ready to light a cigarette and throw his lighted match down on the ground, not realizing he's standing on a propane tank. Oh gosh, I can see that thing going up like I don't know what the TV show was. Animal House's Christmas Vacation, where the Santa and his reindeer flew off into the sky from an explosion. Okay, I told you a lot about anodes and tanks and piping and coatings and how your voltmeter Well, I didn't talk about your voltmeter, but I talked about your electrode. Um, we might have enough time for a couple of questions if you have any. Um, you know, there's I could talk longer if you'd like, but you probably have heard enough. So thank you for your time. I've enjoyed it. Wish you well. Call me or email me if you have any questions. Bye bye.